Welcome to Off the Shelf, Conversations with Authors. I'm Martha Kofod, and our guest today is Mike Just. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Martha.
And you're here to tell us about your book about the Grand Canyon.
That's right. I born and raised in Chicago. I spent about 12 years here in Glenview, and I don't think I first encountered the Grand Canyon until I was probably sometime in my early to mid 30s. And I just went out there on a lark on a spring vacation with my sister, and we decided to take a trip up to the Grand Canyon. Never seen it, just seen it in the pictures like everybody else. And the way the Grand Canyon comes up on you, it reminds me of an ocean. There is ponderosa pine forest, probably the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world, definitely in North America. And so you've got a lot of this gentle rolling to flat terrain, lots of forests, and then all of a sudden, at the last moment, everything breaks open, and it's as if you were approaching the coast of a great sea. And that was my first experience with the Grand Canyon. I fell in love, just like John Denver, who said that he was born in the summer of his 22nd year or something like that. I felt like I was coming home to a place that I'd never been before. And eventually I had to move closer to that place that I loved so much, and that was the Grand Canyon.
Does the canyon as a chasm shock you when you first see it?
Definitely. One thing about the Grand Canyon, there are canyons that are deeper. Even in America, there's Hell's Canyon up in the Idaho region, Snake River Basin, I think. There are canyons that are bigger. There's the Copper Canyon in Mexico. There are canyons that are deeper in South America. There's a deeper and bigger canyon in China. But there is nothing as dramatic as the Grand Canyon. Most of those other canyons are kind of V-cut formations. The Grand Canyon, of course, is a straight up and down affair, a mile deep. And I don't think there's anything as dramatic, both in human history and in natural history, as the Grand Canyon.
But the canyon is actually forested throughout.
One thing that's interesting about the Grand Canyon is the fact that it's forested almost up to the very rim of both rims in many of the sections that are the most popular. If you head farther west towards a place called Toroweep, where there's some volcanic formations, there's not as much forest. At the very beginning of the canyon, at least very up through Marble Canyon, there aren't. But throughout the main sections of the canyon, where most of the 4 million plus visitors a year go, it is definitely forested. The North Rim and the South Rim are at different elevations. The North Rim is at about 9,000, or I think about 8,000 to 9,000 feet. The South Rim is a lot lower than that. One of the things that makes the Grand Canyon so spectacular and so dramatic, both in terms of its human history and its natural history, is the fact that it's about a mile deep. And if you were to do an equivalent walk of life zones, the lower parts of the canyon and its lower reaches at the river are what are called Upper Sonoran Desert regions, which are more endemic to northern Mexico. The North Rim in particular is so high up that it would be akin to being in the Hudson Bay region of Canada. So when you do a hike in the Grand Canyon from the river up to the rim, it's like walking from northern Mexico to southern Canada at Hudson Bay. And that causes a lot of people to have lots of problems, which are some of the topics that are covered in the book that I've written.
You're obviously well versed in the Grand Canyon. Is this personal experience? How did you educate yourself on the Grand Canyon? You
know, that's an interesting question. The book that I wrote, Canyon Calls, was something that I had unintentionally researched probably for years before I wrote the book. Once I started going back to the canyon again and again from the Chicago area until I moved out to the region, I found that I needed to learn more about its natural history. When there was some animal that was trying to get into my backpack, or when I was going down a forest trail and I'd be writing just word pictures, I would just journal about things, and I came up with dozens of essays, and I found out I better find out about what the natural history is here. So a lot of that was intentional, and I have, if you've seen at my house, probably about up to here in field guides and guides on geology. The other thing that became very fascinating to me once I discovered the Colorado Plateau region, of which the Grand Canyon is a part, is the geology. It is just really, really fascinating for anybody who's ever been out there. The cultures, the stratification. The other thing that became very interesting to me once I discovered the Grand Canyon itself were all the ways that people died out there. And that is what led me to write the stories that I wrote.
How did you learn about those people?
Well, by familiarizing myself with some of the people who live and work in Grand Canyon, by reading some of the human history of the canyon, I found out that at least since the era of European exploration, of course, they've been keeping records. There have been cases of miners who've had their caches of gold, had their gold stolen from them and were murdered. There have been cases of husbands going to the canyon to murder their wives. There have been more than one case of robbers and fugitives hiding out below the rims, escaping from the law, sometimes living in caves, waylaying unsuspecting hikers.
How did you research all of that?
Well, there are a few
publications.
There are a few books that are available. There's an interesting book called Death in Grand Canyon, which is a pretty good seller around the rim, written by a man named Dr. Tom Myers, who was a Grand Canyon doctor. And what they've done is they've compiled all the death in Grand Canyon, again, since records have been kept. People will fall into the river. People will jump. Unfortunately, if you recall the movie Thelma and Louise, there were a couple of women who went out and eventually drove. They didn't think they had any other options, so in Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid style, they kind of drove over the rim. Now, that actually was shot and filmed in Canyonlands National Park, which is about an hour and a half from where I live in the Four Corners region. But unfortunately, after that movie came out, there was kind of a rash of people that drove over or attempted to drive over the rim. So things like this have been happening. It's such a dramatic environment. It lends itself to accidental death. It lends itself to people kind of exceeding their limits, and it also lends itself to people trying to hide bodies there. It is the terrestrial equivalent to dumping a body in the middle of an ocean, and that is why it's a trackless area, 277 miles long, 18 miles wide at its widest point, as I've said before, a mile deep, surrounded by thousands and thousands of square miles of national forest, national monument land. And so it lends itself to the dramatic on a number of levels. So in a moment of inspiration, I just kind of got this idea, why not take all these stories and make a quilt out of them? And so the result was Canyon Calls. And there are 10 short stories in all. They cross genres. Because of the nature of the way people have lived and died in the canyon, there's a lot of murder, mystery, suspense stories. There's some ghost stories. There's some fantasy. There's a couple romances in there. Because people come to the canyon for all those reasons. They come there for romance. They come there for adventure. And sometimes they do exceed their limits. And that's what the stories are about.
Your background, is it in writing?
I have an interesting background. Some people go from relationship to relationship, or they go from coast to coast and town to town. I have gone from career to career. I started out as a lawyer back in my early days. I became a teacher, a college professor, a seminar leader. I've done just about 5 or 6 different careers. And finally, I went back to school and I became a psychotherapist. And so I've worked with lots of interesting people over the years. I've worked with sociopaths. When I was an attorney, I worked with criminals. I worked with people really from just about every imaginable spectrum in terms of their behaviors. So what I did when I wrote the book is I decided to make some composites of some of these sociopathic characters, for instance, and they show up in a couple of the stories. The lead story, which is probably the darkest, is called Cache, or Cache if you use the American pronunciation. And it's a story about a Navajo trail guide whose job is to take people below the rim, people who aren't really all that familiar with the Grand Canyon. And what I did is I put him together with a couple of seedy people that he picks up in one of the bars in Grand Canyon Village. And something inside tells him to avoid these men. But he's really, really in need of money, desperate for money. So despite his inclinations, he decides to take these 2 men below the rim, and they end up turning on him. And so what I did is I took some of the people that I have worked with over the years, both as an attorney and as a psychotherapist, and I kind of put it into the main character who opposes him in that story, a guy named Coyle. So my writing is really informed by a lot of my professional experience. The other thing I did is I've been in theater. I was trained as a screenwriter. I've done a lot of acting in the Chicago area before I moved out west. And a book that really inspired me is a book called The Writer's Journey by Chris Vogler, which is based upon the work of Joseph Campbell and his work on myth and storytelling. He wrote a book called Hero with a Thousand Faces. And Joseph Campbell and Chris Vogler in their books talk about the hero of the world myth, which is really common to most of the stories that we're going to read, whether those stories are from the Bible or from a Hollywood movie. The hero will go through a 12-stage journey. And by the way, they use hero interchangeably for male or female. And in the beginning, heroes are usually in their ordinary world, just like you or I right now talking about something. What happens is something impels them to leave. They're called to adventure and they're called into a special world. And the Grand Canyon is definitely a special world. Once you leave its rims and descend even a couple hundred feet below, you realize that you are entering a region, a dimension, so to speak, that is cut off from the ordinary world that we all inhabit. Once you get down to the bottom towards the river, you are completely by yourself. And so I got the idea of another story called Night at the Bottom of the World. What would happen if all the people which you're going to meet from so many different places, from France, French Polynesia, I've met Amish people, I've met people from Europe, pretty routinely, of course, are going to be at the Grand Canyon, people from Asia. What if some event at the surface cut off all contact between the surface world and the people who were at the bottom in a place called Phantom Ranch, which was a hunting camp that was initially set up by Teddy Roosevelt way back when. And the story explores how people react in a situation like that, how leaders are chosen, how people pursue power, how people reach consensus. It involves a young woman who would rather not assume power, but who in fact has very natural leadership skills. And she is pushed to lead these people because another man in their group will be leading them to doom if he gets his way. And his way is to go back up to the surface. Yet every time people have tried to go back up to the surface in the story, they've never returned. So her idea is to get the rest of the people that are at Phantom Ranch, get in some of the Grand Canyon rafts and then sail out of, or boat out of the Grand Canyon. So the idea of the canyon itself as a catalyst, as a character in each of the stories, as something that pushes us beyond our limits sometimes and lets us know what we are made of on the inside, is a theme that you're going to find throughout each of these stories.
I have a couple of questions. You speak of meeting people at the Grand Canyon. Do you meet them on the trails? Do you meet them above?
You meet them everywhere, and that's one of the most fascinating things about going to the Grand Canyon. It is better than going to a major city, I think, because you will meet them on the trails. You will meet them at campsites. You will meet them at Grand Canyon Village. And people tend to be very, very open when they're having these experiences. And I have just had people, I can remember just short conversations that lasted maybe 5 minutes that have helped change my life. A retired engineer one day stopped me and said, "Boy, you better go for your dreams right now or you might run out of time." And my dream was to move out west into the Four Corners region. And so I eventually took him up on that. There are people that I think go to the Grand Canyon to work and live and think that it's going to change their lives. And sometimes those people can run into a problem because they bring themselves along with. And what you have to be able to do to survive an environment emotionally, psychologically like the Grand Canyon is you really need to be able to tolerate your own company and spend a lot of time with solitude. So I've met people from everywhere. There are, of course, the National Park Service people. They tend to be around there a little bit longer. Many of the people who move to Grand Canyon Village to live and work there, they don't last more than a year. I think I met the man who had the distinction of being the longest tenured non-National Park Service employee ever to live and work at Grand Canyon. His name was Mike, and he had been a Chicago native. He had been there for, I think, over thinking 12, 13, 14, 15 years. But what he said is that people come there with a tendency to, think that it's going to change them. And really, it won't unless you're prepared emotionally, I think, to deal with your own solitude. One of the things that fascinates me about the Grand Canyon, and one of the reasons I like to go back again and again and again, is that it fills me with a sense of my own grandeur inside. In the world of people, in the world of cities, there's competition, and I'm always going to find somebody or something that's done better than myself. And I end up feeling smaller, diminished by that type of comparison. When I go to the Grand Canyon, you would think that this immense 277-mile-long chasm would also make me feel diminished by comparison to it. And yet, I find that it almost is kind of an exteriorizing of my own spirit, so to speak. And so it allows me to feel a sense of grandeur about myself. And that's one of the other things I love about it. And that's another thing that comes out as a theme throughout most of the stories.
When you speak of people working and living there at Grand Canyon Village, where exactly is Grand Canyon Village located?
Grand Canyon Village is on the south rim.
So it's above.
It's above. It's on the rim itself. The Grand Canyon is called an inverted mountain. In fact, the word kaibab, a Native American word, I think means something like inverted mountain or mountain range. And the south rim is much more accessible year-round. It's open 365 days a year than the north rim. The north rim, being 1,000 feet higher, is actually closed for 6 months out of the year because of the snows. It's almost like being up in the mountains of Idaho or Montana. It is connected up very easily, the south rim and Grand Canyon Village, with a road system, with a railroad that has been going there for, I think, over 100 years. They have their own medical clinic, they have their own magistrate, they have their own judge, police force, all those types of things. It's pretty easy to get to. The North Rim is much more remote. I actually prefer the North Rim right now. It is de-peopled, and I've got some places where I can be there for days and days and days and not run into hardly anyone. The South Rim, having so many visitors per year, I don't know how many million of people go into that region every year, gets a little bit too crowded for me. When I first started going to the Grand Canyon back in my 30s, I would spend more time at the South Rim because it has a much wider range of vista points. It has a shuttle system that allows you to go back and forth. It's much more people friendly. But as I continue to go back, I become more just wanting kind of my own space. And so I've gone to some places that are just absolutely stunning. And I really wish that I could transport people there. One of the reasons I wrote the book was to be able to do so.
When you speak of people living and working in Grand Canyon, I'm very literal. Do you mean below the surface, down in the canyon itself? Are there houses? Are there residences?
That's very interesting. The majority of the people who live and work of the Grand Canyon, there are the National Park Service and then the non-National Park Service people who might work for Xanterra, the resorts, for instance. There's lots of hotels and restaurants and bookshops, that type of thing, especially on the South Rim. The vast majority of the people who ever visit the canyon stay on the rim, so the vast majority of the people who live and work there are also on the rim. There are some beautiful stone buildings that were designed by Grand Canyon architect Mary Coulter. She actually also did Desert View, which is this watchtower built in the style of a Native American granary, I believe. That's a little bit farther west or east of Grand Canyon Village proper. In the canyon itself, there are very few people that are there full time. There are some corridor trails, which means the trails that go through the Bright Angel Canyon, and these are the most traveled. There's Bright Angel Trail, there's South Kaibab Trail, and then there's a trail that proceeds from North Rim Lodge. At the very bottom of the canyon itself, at the confluence of the Colorado River and Bright Angel Creek, there are a series of buildings called Phantom Ranch that people can actually go down with mules. And one of my stories, leftovers.com, takes place by people taking mules down there. It's a story about a woman who's been perennially disappointed in love, who meets somebody online who she expects is going to be a reincarnation of Brad Pitt, and he ends up, like many online daters, completely misrepresenting himself physically and his age. And this takes place on the mules. The mules become kind of a character. They're something that people have taken down into the Grand Canyon for a long period of time. In answer to your question, there is a ranger who lives, there's a Phantom Ranch station, and he's there all the time. There's also a place called Cottonwood Campground, which is a rest stop from the North Rim, somewhat midway between the North Rim itself and Phantom Ranch, where there's also a ranger. And then there's a place called Indian Gardens that's on the South Rim near the Tonto platform that's about midway between the village, Grand Canyon Village on the South Rim, and then the river itself. So there are very few people who are actually there full time. Most of the people who are down at the bottom are going to be people who are staying for a few days at Phantom Ranch, or they are staying at Bright Angel Campground. There are also some more primitive campgrounds that don't have toilets and water that are located throughout the canyon region that people can get permits to actually, stay for a few days. There's some great places. One of my favorites is a place called Clear Creek Trail, which is about a third of the mile north of Phantom Ranch. And it's unusual because it's one of the only trails that's in the inner canyon. It's also called the Inner Gorge, which is really that world I've described that's cut off from the outside world. And it actually parallels the river on the north bank. And you can take that for, I think, 10 miles to a perennial falls called Chayava Falls. Again, one of the stories takes place there. One of the most fun parts of writing this book was to be able to take my favorite places and put them in stories. Because to me, place is much about character as character is. It really, really does. And so many people have gotten lost, have died, have needed medical evacuations from the Grand Canyon, that I really decided, what is it about this place that pushes us to our limits? And in so doing, helps us to find out inside where we need to change. And I think that's really comes out in just about every one of the stories. One of the interesting things about Grand Canyon is usually, or very often in any event, when someone needs a medevac, when they need to be evacuated medically, and by the way, the National Park Service will charge you for this. Often these are people who are in really great shape. There was a woman who was somewhat of a marathon runner, I believe, a few years ago, and they have pictures of her now all throughout the canyon region. She died. People think that they are tougher than they are, and then they discover, hey, it may be cool here on the rim, it may be 50, 60 degrees, but then you go down about 2,000, 3,000 feet, and all of a sudden it's 90 degrees, and there's no water in most of these locations. And that's how people get themselves into trouble and die.
When you wrote the book, do you become any of the characters, or do you do it character by character in any given story? You
know what? Writers are always writing themselves, even when they don't think they are. So there's always a part of you in every character. And there are a couple of stories that are semi-autobiographical. One of the stories is The Gender Gap, which is kind of a comedy romance piece about a obsessive-compulsive writer / South Rim bartender who is afraid of commitment and falls in love with a National Park Service ranger who is stationed on the North Rim, and he's on the South Rim. And they break up, and she's about to leave town the next day, and then he decides at midnight that he is going to go all the way from the South Rim to the North Rim and meet her. And because he's such a scaredy cat and he's got so many phobias, it just becomes this comedy of errors in the middle of the night, him running down to try to meet her. So that story has a lot of me in it. And don't tell my ex-girlfriend, but it has a lot of her in it too. Another one of the stories that's a little bit darker and a little bit more mystical is called The Abyss. There have been probably about maybe 40 recorded suicides over the years in Grand Canyon. It becomes a place where people come sometimes, and either the canyon gets them in touch with a part of themselves that they're not ready for and they want to jump, or they come there with the idea that they want to jump. And there is a place at Grand Canyon along the South Rim, and it's called The Abyss. And it is considered the longest vertical drop from the rim down. It's very, very, you see it, and it's just this complete flat, sheer-face scarp. And people have come there to jump because it is such a steep place. And in my darker days, when I was younger, there was a part of me that would think, well, I wonder what it would be like to go to the abyss and jump. And so, I'd come up with these ideas about it. And the idea came to me, what if I wrote a story about this character? And here's a man who in cold December goes to the abyss, and he's kind of a loner, and he decides that he is going to wait for all the shuttle buses to go home for the night and all the tourists to go home because it's going to be cold. No one's going to want to stay there past sunset. And then he decides he's going to jump. But then something unexpected happens. He runs into a rather vivacious young woman who really starts to screw up his plans. And he just wants her to go away, but she keeps on following and asking him questions. And that's the setup of The Abyss. So there is some of me in that story too.
Good answer to a complicated question, I guess. Do you have any plans for any future writing?
I actually do. I've written several novels, many short stories. And I pretty much plan to put a lot of my stuff on my website. My website, by the way, you can access it in one of two ways. CanyonCallsTheBook.com, all one word. Or you can go to Just Mike Just. My name, of course, is Mike Just. That's JUSTMIKEJUST.com. And what I plan to do is post a lot of my work on my website. I've written lots of essays on the Southwest, many short stories. I've written some book-length fiction.
Were they published?
I haven't sought publication for anything. Canyon Calls was the first thing that I've ever sought seriously to be published. And the reason is, most of what I've written over the years has been on spec. On spec means it's on speculation, that someone will fall in love with your completely wonderful idea and publish it. Canyon Calls is the first thing that I ever wrote with a specific market in mind. And that was people who would go to the Grand Canyon and, want to kind of hike and discover a little bit more about it. And also people who've never been there who might want to learn a little bit more about it. And so it was the first thing that I ever seriously sought publication for. And so you can pick it up most easily on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. So.
I see. Well, I have a copy of the book here and the illustration on the front of it.
By the way, this, if you can get a shot of this for the cameras, this is an interesting place in Grand Canyon. I believe this could be one of two places. It looks like Nankoweap, but my best guess is that this is Toroweap. Toroweap is a region of Grand Canyon. It's still within a national park, but it's about 40 or 50 miles farther west than pretty much anyone else goes. It's also known for having one of the longest vertical drops in Grand Canyon, and it is a beautiful place to go because it is a volcanic region. There's actually a cinder cone called Vulcan's Throne that actually is right on the rim. So there was mass volcanism not that long ago that actually dammed up the Grand Canyon at one point. And it's a beautiful place to go. You'll need two things if you go to Toroweap. You will need a couple of spare tires because you're bound to get a flat. There's about 60 miles of very, very bad road. The other thing you will need is plenty of water. Don't go in the summertime. I actually went there once in the summer. There was no shade. It was triple digits. And I had absolutely nowhere to go except hunkering down beside a pitiful pinyon tree. So it is a beautiful, beautiful place.
Well, thank you, Mike, for being with us. I appreciate your coming for this interview. And thank you for watching Off the Shelf, Conversations with Authors. I'm Martha Kofoed.